my talk is more about establishing a baseline for the first 2 centuries of British arachnology, because unfortunately, as you'll see in this talk, in comparison to men, the gender bias for women in British arachnology has always been significantly skewed, but very much so, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'd like to start off with Eliza Stabile, who was briefly touched on in the last talk. She was born in the early 1800s, but there's very little known about her life up until the time she started writing her books in the 1860s. There's no known photographs or portraits of her. Indeed, she wasn't the only Eliza Stabile in her family. She had a sister who had almost the exact same name as her. She never married, and she died aged 72 after some time of a period of inactivity in terms of her arachnological and entomological work. So it was only from 1860 onwards that she started to publish on invertebrates. She published both on arachnids and then later on entomology. Indeed, her later entomology work would be reviewed by Alfred Russel Wallace in Nature, who gave a very favourable review to her book. Now, her 2 works on spiders were a book, British Spiders, and a small paper on the cerula, on the maxilla of spiders, which I'll get onto. But first, I'd like to start with her magnum opus, which is British Spiders. Now, this book was intended to be a shortened, more generalist book on British spiders. She took inspiration from John Blackwell's books, but later assessments of her work as a simple copy or abbreviated version of Blackwell's work are simply not true. She credits Blackwell for establishing a baseline for British arachnology with his book, but she states her book is very much more for the generalist reader, and that is definitely reflected in the content. As you can see here, this is my personal edition of her book, and you can see on the front there is a wonderfully embellished spider. Now, this book was published in 1866, and the plates in the book are very similar to those that are found in John Blackwell's books. Indeed, they were made by the same illustrators. However, if one was to compare Blackwell's book with these 2 plates here, which are Eliza Stabile's plates, you'll see that some of the spiders are in very slightly different positions, or they might be upside down as compared to the Blackwell plates. And what this suggests is that they were specially commissioned for her book, which means her own plates, whilst in the style of a lot of Blackwell's illustrations, were uniquely her own. Now, she was also to publish a small article. Now, this article was on the presence of cerula in spiders, which of course we all now know is found in many, many aranomorph taxa. However, at the time, it was still very much a novelty. She took representatives of a number of families of British spiders, and she examined this feature closely. She then figured it in one particular species, which is very common here in the United Kingdom, Agalenia labyrinthica. Now, when this paper was presented in the Annals Magazine of Natural History, it actually had to be communicated by her good friend J.E. Gray. Now, we can see at the top there that it simply says Miss Stabile and not her name. This touches back onto a point that Rosemary made earlier, that when she published her book, and indeed here in the article as well, her first name was never really stated. It was E.F. Stabile in British Spiders and simply Miss Stabile in her journal article. Now, there are reasons for this. It's very important to understand the context in which Stabile was publishing. She was publishing in Victorian Britain, which outside of the royal family was an extremely patriarchal society. Women could not vote. Women had basically no rights after marriage, and you were expected to raise lots of children if you married. There was really very little hope for people like Stabile to gain academic positions, and indeed all of her work was produced on her own time as an amateur, like many others. Now, with her, in particular regards to her work on British spiders, it was reviewed at the time by other colleagues quite favourably, but in more recent assessments of her work, such as Bristow in the middle of the 20th century, her work was just cast aside as a simple copy of Blackwell or an uninteresting variant of a spider book. But in actuality, what we had was a book that told you how to collect spiders. It had important ecological information. And indeed, in many cases, she would take descriptions of a spider and she would add novel information to it. A good example of this was a small linniphiid spider that was described by Blackwell from Broadstairs in Kent, from which very little was known. The spider was preserved on a small microscopic slide and it squashed down. Now, when the spider was described, it was described as a six-sided spider, but it was Stabile who put in the observation that she thought it might just be an ocular anomaly in the spider. So in addition to just having a good general knowledge for readers, she did provide novel information on other aspects of arachnology, and her work indeed was very important. She was to be the only female arachnologist to have evidence of publication in arachnology during the 19th century. Now, I'm going to touch on a little bit later a few of the other names in 20th century British arachnology, but one name really does stand out, and that's Frances Murphy. Most of the people in here who are a little bit older than I will certainly have remembered Frances Murphy. She sadly died in 1995 as a result of liver problems. But when she was born, she grew up in the countryside where she experienced nature like many children did, but then she experienced tragedy. Her mother fell off a horse when she was only about 8 or 9 years old and suffered what today we would call traumatic brain injury. This caused her mum a year later to commit suicide. So obviously Frances had quite a tough upbringing. She then went on to study mathematics and got a degree in mathematics. And it was through this interest and specifically her involvement with aviation that she was to meet John, her future husband. Now, she also became the first female president of the British Entomology and Natural History Society, which is very significant. And she has 1 matronym and 4 combined honorifics with John. Now, you can see on the right-hand side picture here, this is a picture of from the late 60s of John and Frances. The wider picture has more people in it from the early BAS days, but the Murphys were very significant during this time. Frances was the first woman ever to lead field meetings for the BAS, and she did this no less than a couple years after joining the society in the early 60s. Now, Frances published a lot of papers, and many of them were collaborative works. For instance, the work on the left was co-authored with an Italian colleague, and they redescribed the lycosid. But on the right, you see an example of what the primary bulk of her taxonomic contributions were. They were co-authored with John. Here you can see some wonderful figures of an araneid spider. And Frances and John described 3 species together, in addition to providing revisionary remarks for a lot of other taxa. Now, a lot of the rest of her papers were focused on new records for the British spider fauna, ecology, and many other wide-ranging interests. It's important to note that whilst she was an excellent arachnologist, she was also extremely broadly trained, and she could tell you about birds or reptiles or entomological subjects. She really was very much a Renaissance woman, and she was certainly a force of nature for many people during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. She's credited with mentoring a lot of not just the women who were to come up at later points, but also a lot of the men. But she's probably better known for her books. The book on the right, Keeping Spiders, Insects and Other Land Invertebrates in Captivity, reflects her particular expertise in raising spiders and other arachnids in captivity. She would often collect juveniles from the wild while she and John were conducting field work around the world. And she would bring the juveniles back and figure out how to raise them through to maturity. Now, whilst that may sound like a simple concept, at the time, it was not a very simple concept. Even the keeping of invertebrates within the pet trade, which developed later on, was not very established. But Frances led the charge in rearing spiders and other arachnids in captivity consistently on a good scale. And through that, she was able to help a lot of taxonomists with their work. One of the matronyms that she has, or rather the only matronym, the others being combined honorifics, is a jumping spider that Fred Wanless named after her. And it was specifically because she was able to obtain a significant number of samples for him, including juveniles, which she raised through to maturity, including new species. Frances was also a member of some of the founding hobbyist communities, such as the British Tarantula Society. She was a member of them for many years. But she's also very well known for the book that was published after her death with John, and that's an introduction to the spiders of Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not going to go too much onto this because obviously Dimitri has gone over this book, but this book was a significant contribution to South Asian spiders. Not only did it contain novel taxonomic data, but it provided distribution data and, most importantly, ecological data, which was collected firsthand by the Murphys during their travels. Sadly, later in her life, Frances was not able to travel as much because of her recurrent liver problems. But during the 70s and 80s, she travelled rather extensively, not just for field work, indeed, also for international conferences. where she built on her reputation as an approachable, knowledgeable woman who was there to help anybody along with their arachnological journey. Now, small steps of progress were to be made by other women in the BAS during the 20th century. So membership in general increased through the 20th century. Indeed, one of the first founding members was a woman, Una Dalton. She's mentioned in the first meeting of the BAS, but it would be some years until we had more contributions from women. First from Elizabeth Crowson, the Scottish botanist and arachnologist who contributed new records of British spiders, but also moving on to other names such as Glenys Hassell, who did some work on the Octavius Piccard Cambridge collection at Oxford University Museum of Natural History with Ted Lockett, and with particular regard to Una Dalton, who was the first member. While she was the first member, she was one of the only women who didn't publish during their time in the BAS. Most of the women that joined the BAS during the 60s and 70s went on to publish in the journals. Now, comparatively, as you'll see later on, this isn't much when you look at the percentages of men and women publishing, but it is significant to note that many of the women that joined the BAS retained themselves within the BAS and made a very big name for themselves. Women also became area organisers at the start of the beginning of Britain's spider recording scheme during the 80s. Of course, Frances was to be the first area organiser. She was the area organiser for Surrey for some years until she gave it up for ill health. Other names which are important to mention here, Deborah Proctor, who I know is here with us today, the late Jennifer Newton, Kate Hawkins, Isabel Hull, Isabel Baldwin and Helen Reid all made significant contributions to the spider recording scheme. Women began to publish academic articles in the bulletin of the BAS, now Arachnology, of course, from its third issue onwards. And no surprise again, the first article to be published by a woman in the academic journal was from Frances Murphy. So if we look at this first
3 minutes.
Here, okay, no problem, Jan. So here we can see a general trend in publications. We can see a jump in articles at the end of the 70s, which I'll touch on briefly. A lot of that was contributed by female arachnologists from outside the UK, but who were dedicated members of BAS. But here we can see only 13% of publications in the Bulletin of the British Arachnological Society were authored by women. And we can still see that the vast majority was authored by men. When we look at the newsletter, the percentage is even lower. We're looking at just over 5%. But where we have these spikes of women contributing more articles, this generally tends to relate and tie in with those women that joined the BAS in the early days and pioneered themselves as regular members and or later on as area organisers for the SRS. Now, the SRS has its own publication. It's since been amalgamated with the BAS newsletter and is an addendum at the end, but it used to be its own standalone publication. And in here, despite the fact that there were many women organisers, not very many articles were published by women, but this particular publication is a special example because the vast majority of articles authored in this publication were by the national organiser, and up until now, all of the national organisers of the SRS being men. So there is a slight bias here on that particular low percentage of 1.8, but still the trend remains women publish significantly less than men. When we look more broadly, we can see in a total of all of the publications from 1800 to 2000 published in any of the BAS publications, only 152 of them were published by women. That's just 7%, and that shows a significant gender bias. Now, of course, it's improving in the 21st century, but because I was only able to gather complete empirical data for the first 2 centuries of British arachnology, I've chosen that as the cut-off point. So how did the UK compare to other countries during the 20th century? Well, women were established taxonomists in other countries for quite a while before we were to get our first arachnological taxonomists like Frances Murphy in the 60s. Tamara McCades, Rita Schiapelli and Berta Gershman were all examples in other countries of fantastic taxonomists who published very widely on their groups. Britain very much lagged in comparison to other countries in terms of its arachnological output from women, but hopefully that's something that's changing for the future. So I'd like to end this with some thanks to Jan and also to Sylvia Lucas in Brazil, who have been important role models for me for many years. As Rosemary touched on a little bit earlier, it's really important for us as women to have those role models in order to progress through our careers. Thanks also to Dimitri for his support of the project, to Yuri Murizik for allowing me use of the picture of Tamara, Francis Farcox provided me with data on the life of Eliza Stabile, and Rowley Snazzle provided the picture on the left-hand side of the Francis Murphy slide. Also, a thanks to the organising committee who have helped and assisted with this symposium, and thanks to everyone that's joined, because through joining you are helping to contribute to the memory and the legacy of the Murphys and of Mike Roberts. Thank you.